And the recording has begun. And there's Michelle. Excellent. And I've unmuted your mic, Michelle. So, again, I want to welcome everyone to AMCD's Acervic and I believe Algebetics first webinar of the year with the topic of microaggressions experienced by persons of color, LGBTQIA identities, and those living with disabilities. Implications for counselors. I'm going to allow our outstanding panel to introduce themselves. But once again, I just wanted to remind everyone that I have placed everyone's mic on mute right now, and there'll be Q&A opportunities at the end of the presentation. At that time, I will unmute everyone, and I will ask everyone to turn their camera on so that we can see you as we communicate. But during the presentation, the only cameras that will be on will be the three presenters, Dr. Hennessy, Ms. Brown-James, and Ms. Bradham Kuzar. So again, if everyone else can turn their camera off while we begin this webinar, be most helpful. Thank you. So with that being said, I'm going to know that I have already sent out the notes for this presentation. I sent them out about 20 minutes ago, so everyone should receive them. And I'm going to now share my screen. Can everyone see that? See the presentation, presenters?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And here we go.
Put it in. Yeah, thank you.
And there we go. All right. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and allow each of you to introduce yourselves, share with us your role currently, and then we'll begin. So, and we'll go by alphabetical order. So, Ms. Brown-James, go ahead and begin.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Letitia Brown-James. I'm really excited to have you here tonight with us. And I am a doctoral candidate at Walden University, just submitted and my dissertation and working on revisions on racial microaggressions. You know, microaggressions is an area of research for me and expertise, but I'm doing my dissertation on the racial aspects of microaggression. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida, qualified supervisor, current treasurer of AMCD, and immediate past president of FAMCD, which is the Florida Association for Multicultural Development, a division of the Florida Counseling Association. Thank you again for joining us.
Ms. Bradley.
Okay. Is there a next one? All right. My name is Michelle Bradham Kuzar, and I am the current past president of the American Association for Rehabilitation Counselors. I'm currently a supervisor. Are you guys able to hear me currently? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. I'm currently a supervisor for Manatee County, right here in the state of Florida, and we work with individuals with disabilities. We also work with counselors that are wanting to get into the field of disabilities as well. So one of the things that we look at is how do we help an individual with a disability live a self-fulfilling life. I am also currently a doctoral candidate. I've already submitted my dissertation for defense in the area of rehabilitation counseling as it relates to individuals with traumatic brain injury. So I welcome each and every one of you guys, and thank you so much for being here.
Ms. Bradham Kuzar, in your leadership role?
Past president, immediate past president of the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association. Additionally, past president of the Florida Counseling Association, past president of the FAMCD, past president, and that's kind of where I'm at on those leadership spectrums in a lot of different areas. And so play a lot of different hats, and I love what I do. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hennessy.
Hey everyone, I'm Rachel Hennessy. I recently completed my PhD at the University of Florida, and I'm now a visiting assistant professor at Oklahoma State University here in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Currently, I'm
Dr. Hennessy, can you speak up or turn your volume up? It's a little difficult to hear you.
Yes, I'm sorry, I have a little bit of an older microphone. It's the only one I have available, but are you able to hear me now?
You still sound a little far, but it's a little better.
Okay. So I was saying I'm currently a visiting assistant professor at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. I am on the executive board of LGBTQ as the graduate student trustee, and prior to that role, I did serve as the graduate student for Florida LGBTQ for 2 years. I completed my dissertation on LGBTQ affirmative competencies and intersectionality theory. So thank you all for coming.
Excellent, excellent. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll be manning the slides, so panel, let me know when to move and when to stop.
Okay, would you go back to the welcome slide for a second, Sean? Dr. Smith? Okay, Michelle? You're muted, Michelle.
Sorry. So one of the things that we would love for each and every one of you as you join the call, I know we still have some individuals joining us. Welcome from Alaska. We would love for you to place your current location, your current work setting, and some of your experiences with marginalized communities. Additionally, as a disclaimer, this webinar, as Dr. Sean Smith has already shared, will be recorded and will be disseminated throughout the sponsoring organization. And so throughout this webinar, your comments and anything that you place into the chat window will become public within the organizations as shared information. So thank you, everyone. I see that we also have some individuals from many different areas within the counseling profession. I see Georgia on there. I also see some of the various different states on there. Welcome, everyone, as we continue on. I see Washington there. Welcome from university as a career counselor. Welcome from Houston. Ooh, a lot of people. This is great. As I look through the chat window, so we will know that we have a community of network of individuals that are interested. We have Maryland on the line. We also have Pennsylvania on the line. Welcome, Pennsylvania. We welcome you to this presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Dr. Smith, you could change the slide now. Yeah. All right, so a little bit about our objectives for tonight. As I'm sure we all may agree, there's no way to cover every single thing about microaggressions in general, but definitely with the different populations that we'll be talking about. We're just going to scratch the surface a little bit, but we will start off by defining what microaggressions are, the impact of microaggressions, and particularly as it relates to persons of color, individuals living with disabilities, the LGBTQIA populations, and intersectionality of how that all comes together. And I can't see my last objective because the chat window is covering it, and counseling interventions, of course. So that's what we're intending to cover tonight. Next slide, please. All right, so people often ask, what are microaggressions? Okay, so I put a couple of definitions on here. The first two are just general definitions that we found in the literature about what microaggressions are. Starting with the first one, they are the everyday verbal, nonverbal things that people may say or do that may manifest in the form of a derogatory or negative message, communicating something hostile. It may be intentional or unintentional, but it still could be hurtful or offensive to the person who is on the receiving end. Nadal et al. Define microaggressions as subtle forms of discrimination, often unintentional again and unconscious, which sends that negative or derogatory message to the persons or groups of people that are the targets of microaggressions. And then another definition that we have is racial microaggressions, which are defined as brief and commonplace daily verbal environmental things that people may do intentionally or unintentionally, again, communicating hostility, derogatory, negative messages based on a person's race that can be in the form of a slight or an insult to a target person or group that's on the receiving end of them. Next slide, please. Will you go to the next slide, please? Okay. All right. So when individuals experience microaggressions, the literature is very clear that they are linked, or they can be linked to physical conditions such as hypertension, obesity, heart disease, and other conditions, just based on the emotional turmoil that it has on the individuals that can exacerbate or even correlate with physical conditions, which I think is really interesting to us as counselors, because what is our main goal? Our main goal is to look at the wellness of the entire person, not just the emotional or mental aspect, but their physical aspect, and looking at their holistic health and wellness. So mental and emotional issues such as stress, depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, lack of anger control may manifest because of a person experiencing microaggressions. And oftentimes when a person of color or anyone experiences microaggression because of a part of their identity, it's often something that happens on a recurrent basis. It's usually not just a one-time occurrence. So after a while, individuals start to kind of get into that fight or flight mindset, if you will, and try to protect themselves, which could create additional stress, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and a sense of hypervigilance. Hypervigilance tends to come up a lot with individuals who experience microaggression, where they feel, depending on where they are in the setting that they're in, they may feel like they're constantly on guard because they're being targeted. They're a target of a microaggression. Next slide. Okay, so sometimes people will ask questions like, well, what is a microaggression? Is it something that's really small? Because the first part of the word micro, the prefix, could be very misleading. And so individuals might think, well, it's something small that's happening. It's not a big deal. People are being too sensitive and things like that. But in reality, a microaggression can be very impactful to a person's life. And we will talk a little bit, I believe, on the next slide about the different types of microaggressions and how they can occur in a small behavior or a much larger behavior that can impact the individual. Wait, did we skip a slide? I feel like we skipped a slide. Can we go back for a second? One more. Okay, there we go. Yeah, somehow we skipped this slide. Okay, so the three types of microaggressions are micro insults. So these are the rude or insensitive things that people may say or do that communicates to the person that's on the receiving end may feel degraded or insulted. So for example, a doctor, let's say, walks into a patient's room and they're a person of color, and the patient or someone that's in the room assume that they are a lab technician or they are a nurse. Not that anything is wrong with either of those professions, but the assumption is this person cannot be in the role of a physician, for example. That's an example that comes to mind, and that comes up a lot when you talk to professionals who are on the receiving end of a micro insult. Then the next one is a micro invalidation. And these are situations where the person is maybe communicating their lived experience with someone, and that person may try to deny or minimize that experience by telling them that maybe you're reading too much into that, or you're being too sensitive, or I don't think that's what they meant when they did this or when they said that. So the thoughts or feelings of someone from another culture might be minimized because the person that they're communicating with may think that they're just blowing it out of proportion, if you will. Very, very invalidating. And then the last one is a micro insult. Now, these are the ones that occur in more overt forms of discrimination or actions. For example, someone being racially profiled in a store or during a routine traffic stop, and that can lead to even verbal attacks, sometimes nonverbal, such as maybe purse clutching or crossing the street, for example, when they see a person of color or a male, for example, walking by them and they perceive that person as a threat. So the micro assaults are the more overt forms of these occurrences that people often experience. Okay, next couple of slides, I think. Okay, so now I will turn it over to Dr. Hennessy for a little bit, and then I'll come back and we'll go over some case examples together. You're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about intersectionality, which will be something we'll be touching on throughout this presentation. Dr. Smith, there should be more on this slide. Thank you. So some people may have heard of intersectionality before. Oftentimes people think of intersectionality simply as a combination of identities, but intersectionality actually is a pretty complex theory that focuses on interlocking systems of power and oppression, which affect people differentially based on their social locations, based on those identities. It actually was created through women of color feminism, starting as far back as Sojourner Truth, and really being developed by feminists such as Audre Lorde, Patricia Hill Collins, and more recently, Kimberly Crenshaw and Sarah Ahmed. Next slide, please. So what is intersectionality? It's actually an analytical tool that we can use for critical inquiry and praxis. And some major tenets of that are the idea that systems of power and oppression, such as racism, heterosexism, classism, and ableism, are actually all interlocking, that there are similar power structures that create all of these different systems of power. Another tenet is that people are affected by these systems differentially based again on those social locations. So different identities such as race, gender, affectional orientation, and ability will impact how people fit into those systems. When we think about it from the individual level, thinking about our work as counselors, we can view identities as being holistic in that they can't really be separated. So for instance, if we think about the experiences of a woman who identifies as African American and lesbian, we can't really ask her to pick apart those different identities and view them individually because they co-construct each other throughout her life. Now, from the structural level, we also see that systems of oppression cannot be separated. And again, because they stem from similar power systems, they can't really be addressed individually either, which is why we see things like coalitions and solidarity and people working together for multiple different issues. So when we think about intersectionality as it relates to microaggressions, we can understand that microaggressions could be based on multiple aspects of a person's identity. So if someone does hold multiple marginalized identities, such as being LGBTQ and a person of color, or holding a disability, there could be microaggressions that are really specific to the intersections of those identities that maybe can't necessarily be chalked up to just having to do with one. We can see that microaggressions can manifest in various different forms of racism, oppression, and marginalization. And so several scholars have worked on trying to explore the experiences and impact of intersectional microaggressions and really critiqued past literature that views identities as being separate or discrete from one another. I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about some of that research. So Nadal specifically has done a lot of work in this area, so definitely someone to look up in the literature. And he completed a qualitative study looking specifically at intersectionality and microaggressions. There were 7 different themes that came up in this study. So these were those that were very commonly experienced. One being exoticizing women of color. The second one is gender-based stereotypes for lesbians and gay men. The third is disapproval of LGBT identity by various different racial, ethnic, and religious groups. The fourth is the assumption of inferior status of women of color. Then the invisibility and desexualization of Asian men. Assumptions of inferiority or criminality of men of color, and gender-based stereotypes of Muslim men and women. So you can see that these are definitely intersectional issues where multiple different identity categories come into play.
Okay. Thanks, Rachel. So we wanted to make the presentation interactive and not just us talking at you the whole time. So we incorporated some case examples, which I am going to cover from the racial microaggressions section of the presentation, and just get your thoughts on ways to work with a client that may present with a similar situation. So first we have Malik, who is a male of Black descent and comes into counseling at the suggestion of his supervisor, for having anger outbursts at work. And you may remember from the previous slide, we talked a little bit about poor anger control being one of the symptoms of a person experiencing microaggression. So Malik explains to his counselor that he's never been to counseling before, and people often take his passion for aggression. During your assessment with him, you learn that he does not like police because he's been racially profiled by police officers multiple times in his life. So in the chat box, I'm going to ask 2 questions, and you can just chime in by typing your response if you'd like to. So the first question is, how would you respond to Malik during the assessment, considering what he has shared thus far about his experience of being a Black male? And then how would you incorporate his feelings about negative interactions with law enforcement during your counseling sessions? So we'll take a minute for people to think about their responses and what initially comes to mind, given this case example.
So Letitia, Wayne has shared that they would ask for the perspective on whether they express anger to see if he agrees or not. Jeff says, would ask if anything recent has occurred that upset him. Aaron shares that would hypothesize that his supervisor might have a biased attitude towards the client's perceived anger. Carol shares, first, I would thank him for taking a risk and reaching out to me. Second, I would validate his feelings about his experiences. And with the police, the idea is to build a trust relationship. Ray shares, I would ask for him to explain the difference in how he expresses passion and anger. Molly shares, validation of experiences. Anna shares, I would respond with empathy, and my first thought is to gather more insight on the power dynamics and that led him to the counseling. Did his boss force him? What does the passion look like for him at work? Thank you, Camille. Definitely validation. Thank you, Gideon. I'd be interested to understand how he experienced anger and how he experienced his passion. Kristen shares, perhaps ask him for examples of his expression in passion and aggression. Arian says, I would ask him for the reason for referral and inquire about his relationship with his supervisor concerning the supervisor interactions can be minimized. Did you want more?
Yeah, let's do like 2 or 3 more, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Okay. So Walter shares, I would ask him, his experience has occurred in different settings. Gabrielle says, I would ask him to tell me more about Malik's interactions in law enforcement. Validation is imperative in this situation. Dale says, I don't like the police either.
Okay. Well, those are all really great answers. Thank you so much for sharing. We don't have time to go through all of them, but they're all really great answers, and I think would take the conversation with Malik into a very interesting perspective. One of the things that I liked about everything that you all have shared is that you're taking the time, even in a psychosocial assessment, to ask more about that, which would definitely help. And I don't want to get too much into the interventions, but to build that rapport and safety to let him know that this is a safe place that he can talk about these things. So thank you for sharing. Dr. Smith, will you move to the next slide, please? All right, so we have another case example here, and this is with Sharon, a 50-year-old biracial grandmother of Hispanic and Black descent. She comes in expressing concern about her twin grandchildren that she is raising. They're about 18 and getting ready to go off to college shortly. And Dr. Smith, something happened to the PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. I don't remember all the details of the case study, and I don't want to mess it up, so I'll wait till we get back to that slide. Because these 2 case studies, we're going to talk about them twice in the presentation, so I didn't want to merge them together. So yeah, so she's raising the grandchildren, as I mentioned, and they're getting ready to go off to college. They got a scholarship to a predominantly white institution, and Sharon is expressing some concern, feeling worried about how they may be judged at school because they are of a darker complexion. And she has been seeing on the news a lot lately where persons of colors are being hurt or killed due to racial profiling. But she's also concerned because her friends are thinking that she's being too paranoid. So there we have that micro-invalidation again. So she's asking you as the counselor, do you think she's being too paranoid as well? How would you respond to that particular question if you were Sharon's counselor and that's what she asked you? So again, just take a few minutes to put some thoughts that comes to mind in the chat box, and we'll talk about it a little bit.
All right, well, thank you. No, I don't think you're paranoid.
Okay, so that validation would be good. Thank you, Dale.
Validation, yes. Anna shares, I would respond with care and concern. If the feelings are real to her, they are valid and worthy. She is not paranoid, but I would want to discuss more about her friend's responses of her being paranoid. Gabrielle says, I would first validate her thoughts on colorism. Even with the Black and brown communities, colorism has negative connotations. Dominique says, I would validate her reality of discrimination. Aaliyah says, I would acknowledge that her experience has led her to the fear that her grandchildren will be judged and misunderstood.
Excellent. Again, these are all great responses to say to her. We have about two more, Michelle. We can just do the last two and then.
Okay, sounds great. Walter shares, learn more about how she witnessed her grandchildren in current situations and what strengths they have. Lauren says, I would validate her feelings, respond with empathy, and probably use an open-ended question to her about other times this experience may have happened to her, that she is viewed as paranoid for expressing a real concern. What does that mean for her? What for her relationships? Miranda, you want me to share about Miranda's too?
Sure.
Okay. Miranda says, I would want to know more about her and her grandchildren's experiences. I would also demonstrate empathy on many fronts, color, police, and her grandchildren leaving the nest.
Wow, yeah, those are all great responses. Okay.
Deanna and Brittany also responded. So
see, and wish we had time to jump into all of the responses. Okay, thank you all for sharing. Those are all really great examples. Okay, next slide, please. Because I think, all right, so this ends the racial microaggressions part of the presentation as well as the introduction. And then now we're going to segue into the next part. But before we do that, we wanted to take some time to see if anyone had any questions or pressing comments about what we've covered so far. And if so, you can just type it into the chat box. Okay. All right, nothing yet, but feel free to type it in if something comes up later on for you, but we'll stop. We'll have like these little intermissions as we go to see if you have any questions or comments that you want to share. So moving on to the next slide and the next section where Michelle will talk to us a little bit about persons living with disabilities and microaggressions.
Letitia,
yes.
Just a few quick questions here that was posted. I'll just read one of them.
Oh, okay.
Aaliyah asks, what do you think is something some counselors fail to recognize or name during the intake process?
Very, very good question, Aaliyah. And I'm going to speak from my experience, particularly with the racial microaggressions or just racism in general. Racism is a topic that we as a country don't really like to talk about. You know, it can be uncomfortable, triggering, and so we tend to shy away from it. So within the counseling profession, I've seen supervisees and colleagues, they will ask the demographic question, or if it's an assessment where the client is filling it out on their own, they may not take the time to find out about race-related issues. For example, if someone has, let's say, a disability or something, we as counselors may be more inclined to delve a little bit into that. For example, asking a question such as, what does living with blindness, let's say, means for you? And we may ask a little bit more questions, but when it comes to issues of race or even sexuality, that's another hot topic that we don't like to talk about. We'll tend to kind of gloss over it as much as possible or move on to the next thing, which can be very triggering or damaging for our clients. And then I see Carol wrote, this may be the first time I truly understood the concept of intersectionality. Thanks. You're welcome, Carol. That's why we're doing this. And then I see one more from Elena. What would you recommend to counselors in dealing with microaggressions from colleagues or seeing other microaggressions? Ooh, that's a good one. Let's table that question, Elena. Don't let us forget about it, but we'll talk about that. We can incorporate that more when we get to the end, talking about the interventions. We don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but thank you. Excellent question.
Well, this is a great segue as we've discussed about the areas of microaggression and various areas that we need to continue to discuss. Now, one of the things that I always have to say, because I love this area of disabilities, is the largest minority in the world, persons with disabilities, because it can happen in anyone's home. It can happen to anyone at any time in their life. It can happen to family members. It could also happen to people that we know that we're close to as well. So we are the largest minority in the world, and sometimes individuals may get to a perception that, oh, that just happens to just that household. But no, it can happen to anyone's household. Becoming disabled by Garland and Thompson, there is a clear collective notion of what it means to be a woman, a person of color, an individual that is gay, transgender, than we do of what it means to become disabled. Now, within the disability communities, individuals may have varying perceptions. We have to look at various areas that if the individual obtained a disability that was sudden, we can go to the next slide, Dr. Smith. Thank you. If it was a sudden disability, if it occurred over the lifetime, if the individual was born with a disability, these are all the areas that we look at. Has this caused unrelated trauma to the individual? Has this continued to manifest in other areas, such as them returning to work? We deal with the individuals that are veterans, that are returning back from war or back from different types of political climates that may be out there as well. So one of the things that we are looking at is, how does that affect an individual's life? Now, disability illegally was defined in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It was redefined in 1990. We utilize the person-centered language, an individual with a disability. And this person may have a physical or mental impairment that limits one or major life activities, one or more of the major life activities. And some of those areas, for instance, different disabilities that we may have within our community that we deal with as rehabilitation counselors, is we would look at cerebral palsy, blindness. These are just different areas because they may affect, sometimes we may have an individual that it never affects the individual. Like I had an amputee. The individual was actually born without a limb, and so they had gotten used to not utilizing the limb, so they were no longer in the category of a disability, although they did have some functional limitations. So we may have individuals that may have Down syndrome, schizophrenia, brain injury, intellectual disability, anxiety, autism. We go across the entire gamut of the spectrum, from physical to mental disabilities. And how does this affect an individual, and how does it help with them in order to get to the next level? Arlene, that's a great question. I think I see that in the chat window, that you inquired about talking about some of those hidden disabilities. Yeah, brain injury is a big hidden disability that happens with individuals, that the individual may appear to have every functional capacity available, but then but everyone else perceives that the person is okay, but then they have realized that there's some areas that they may be deficient in, such as maybe the memory is being affected. We may have some executive functioning areas that may be affected as well. We may additionally have some of those areas that they may be limited in, but in the counseling world, we look at what are their abilities. We know that these are their limitations, but what are their abilities so that they can be well prepared to counteract a lot of those different areas that may be occurring within their life. Some of those limitations may be understood in regards to those role stigmas, discrimination, hostility, some barriers, some of those perceptions of prejudice and stereotyping by Sacco Ben in 2004. One of the things that we do within our field is we help to bring awareness, and that awareness may come through an evaluation. So that awareness about that individual's attitudes, or our own attitudes as counselors and as therapists within the field of working with an individual with a disability, and how it's impacted their own attitudes, their family's attitudes, the people around them, the attitudes of everyone that's around them as well. We may be able to have that opportunity to begin to evaluate. If it's to evaluate one of their own, they will be able to have an evaluation of their own disability and begin to learn ways of how to adjust and to become stronger in those ways, to become stronger with the abilities that they currently have. I can give an example. Well, we'll get to some examples. I'm not going to give an example right now because I'll jump way ahead and give you a whole example of some of the cases that we've dealt with and stepped over the boundary lines where we never thought we could step over. Even, I'm gonna just give one client, just a quick one. So one of my clients that I had at one time was diagnosed schizophrenia, had a felony record where he actually was convicted of murder. And the individual, we had to overcome some barriers of social interaction, working with the doctors to make sure that medication was present and the individual was stable. We had to do some career evaluations where we utilized some of our career assessments as well. And again, we looked at some of the areas of his current limitations. Where could we find the strengths within this individual and get them back integrated into society? And with success, we were able to get this individual where he came off from the parole and everything else. We were able to actually get him into as a janitor, and he loved it from this point on. So I just wanted to share that as well. So some further insights. One of the biggest things is counselors join in and make the time for training opportunities. And I appreciate all of the individuals that are here for these training opportunities to get to learn more about disabilities and what's going on with the disabilities. In the next slide, we also talk about intersectionality as well, which speaks to the challenges associated with individuals belonging to the multiple minority groups. And Rachel shared in regards to how those persons' statuses in different areas and different minority groups actually influences their positions within society. One of the things Crenshaw of 1989 and Rosenblatt talks about that of 2009. We have those institutions that become those areas where it can occur, where microaggression can occur. We have some of those in the schools, the education, the work setting. Within our community, we may have ableism. We may have discrimination and social prejudice against the stereotyping of individuals with disabilities. Within the own groups of the communities, that we may have an individual that is deaf or hard of hearing. An individual who has latent deafness may be discriminated within the deafened community because of the fact that they may be of a latent deafness and they may not associate with that community, but they still can continue to associate with the hearing world because that's what they feel comfortable with. And then some of our laws that are out there that may not support the areas of making sure that everyone has an accessible area as well. So as we continue to have this conversation, let's revisit Malik. Okay, as Letitia shared earlier, Malik was an individual that came into counseling session in regards to the boss really wanting them to get a handle on the anger. So Malik came back to the next session with a psychological assessment. And from the psychologist, it revealed that Malik had schizoaffective disorder, which affects his ability to respond appropriately under stressful conditions due to lower frustration and tolerance. So what guidance would you provide to Malik? How could you support Malik through difficulty of understanding the psychological evaluation and how it affects him? And what additional information would you use to help Malik? So if you can answer those questions in the chat, that would be great. All right, so it looks like we have Jeff has supported, let's see, Ariane said, Jeff, the literature would agree, and racial identity can impact whether teachers, administrators, employers recognize the giftedness of the intellectual disability community. So,
excuse me, Michelle, I'm sorry. I don't know if you know, that comment is in response to a comment that Jeff placed above that I think, if I remember correctly, gifted students are often overlooked as having a learning disabilities from his colleagues. So that was what their response came from.
Okay.
Yes, yes, that's correct. Aaron indicated I might refer to a psychologist I trusted to confirm that diagnosis or assess him myself.
Correct.
Wayne also shared or actually asked, does he understand diagnosis and what it means? How does he feel about it?
Mm-hmm. Great question.
And then Dale shares, I'm cautious of such a diagnosis of Malik.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Dale also shared that I would review the criteria with him in regards to the diagnosis of the disorder. Mm-hmm. Very good. Was assessment culturally competent? Great question. This is why we are here. Because as we know, many of the psychological assessments are not, and this is one of the biggest areas that we would want to begin to have that conversation. When I was actually doing my full review as far as disability and how it's integrated within the multicultural perspective, there's very few research that was supportive of this information within an empirical data. Because of that, a lot of it was on the premise of a lot of qualitative information. And so that's why I was speaking in my dissertation. I talk about that in regards to speaking from a multicultural perspective as far as what we relate with individuals with a disability, because that field is actually really does not have the depth that we want to be able to speak culturally for individuals within the psychological assessments. When we are looking at individuals across the states, if you're an LMHC or an LPC, how do we define the individuals? And was there some relation in regards to an individual having a diagnosis of schizoaffective? Have I noticed across the board in the last 15 years that I've been within the practice of working with people with disabilities, an overwhelming response of individuals of color coming back with a bipolar diagnosis or schizoaffective? Oh, by far. More so than any other diagnosis that the individual may come with. Absolutely. Was there any other questions that you guys saw as they were popping through? This is great discussion.
No, I saw mostly some very insightful comments.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and revisit Sharon so that we can make sure that we have enough time for Rachel to get back to her part. So let's revisit with Sharon. As we remember, Sharon is the biracial grandmother, Hispanic and Black, that is concerned about her twins. Sharon revealed a psychological evaluation was conducted on Micah and Leah to reveal that both of them were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and have an individual education plan. On the GARS-3, their performance supports the diagnosis of ASD at a level 2 requiring substantial support. A social cognition subtask indicates that they have a low average ability in naming emotions and impaired abilities in recognizing inflection in speech, which also supports the diagnosis of autism. Several times during the session, Sharon asked the counselor, "What did you just say?" This indicates that she may have a hearing impairment. What guidance would you provide to Sharon? How could you support Sharon through her difficulty of understanding or potentially hearing what's going on within the evaluation of her grandchildren? And what additional information would you provide? Thank you, Carol.
Anna actually asked the question, might this not be a hearing impairment? Could this be Sharon's way of asking for another explanation or additional content?
Correct. And one of the things that we could do is we could assess Sharon further for hearing, but then we could also provide the information in another format that may be more understandable for Sharon. For instance, in my office, I have counselors that can speak more than one language so that we can provide that within her own cultural language. Another way is to provide it in written material that maybe she can take it home, read it with some of the supports that she may have at home if she's not able to fully understand it here. So there are some other opportunities that we can present, but we do not want to be negligent to recognize that is there something else that Sharon may be experiencing as far as some anxiety with the grandchildren in various areas as well. Because Sharon was the actual one that came to us within our office. Now, you're probably like, is this a true case? These are true cases, just the information has just been revamped for this current situation.
Ray actually makes a comment. The ability to articulate emotions and recognize speech inflection have strong cultural connections as well, not just mental health or cognitive issues.
Correct. Now that would be where we would need to really sit down and really discuss, and that's going to come back from our psychosocial. Remember, we did do the psychosocial at the very beginning, and if we've noticed anything throughout our session, we can go back to that psychosocial, what we also call the preliminary assessment, to see if there's anything different or some other things that may be underlying that we can begin to work with the individual to support them through, so that she would have a healthy movement with her children. And I love what one of our participants said earlier. It could be that she just doesn't want to release the children, that she's not ready for them to be out of the nest as well. Okay, thank you everyone. So we'll move to the next section where we begin to discuss another portion of, we have individuals within multiple marginalized communities. And these types of things, yes, thank you. And these types of things can be very subtle within the discrimination. These ploys, we have to be conscious. They can be conscious or they can be unconscious in regards to what is occurring within a community. And so if we're more aware, we will begin to have that opportunity to begin to disseminate the information. And so some of the information that we have learned is that there is a lack of research of this area within individuals within the disabled community, with individuals with a disability. There's that lack of environment where we have that influence, where we have the institutional areas or institutional offices providing an effective environment to discuss the individual's experiences. Crenshaw talks about indicate the theoretical and political and social perspectives of groups within multiple marginalized communities, identities that do not consider the experiences of the subgroup. Then we look at what Harley, Nowak, Gassier, and Savage says, that they discuss the multiple identities of persons with disabilities belonging to the LGBTQIA community as well. So we have a long way to go within our research, and we want to continue to develop the conversation. Because of the lack of research, we want to continue to express what we need to. Thank you. Rachel.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to start talking about LGBTQIA specific microaggressions. First, I'm going to cover a little bit from the literature. Then I'll discuss minority stress theory and how microaggressions can have an impact on mental health and wellness. And then I'll have a couple of case studies for you as well. So just to start, for anyone who's not familiar with the acronym LGBTQIA, or sometimes QQIA, it does stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, and asexual. So I'll say right away that in terms of intersex and asexual identifying persons, that there's definitely not a lot of literature. That's pretty much a historical issue, but whether it's about microaggressions or other topics, that we don't have a lot of literature which is definitely something to work on. If anyone out there is interested in becoming a researcher, that might be an area where you could make a big difference. So Gartner and Sturzing found in a study of sexual and gender minority youth that 74% of sexual minority and gender minority youth reported experiencing being called some type of slur or insult directly to them within their last academic year. Now that's a pretty large number. If you're not familiar, sexual minority is a term that sometimes refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual identities, whereas gender minority would refer to transgender and gender nonconforming. So another 75% stated that they experienced sexual orientation specific microaggressions. So for example, this could be using the word gay as a descriptive term for something that's negative. So that's something that's still very common. Additionally, 33% stated that they experienced overhearing gender minority specific microaggressions often in the last academic year. So they specified interpersonal microaggressions as those that are either directed at the person or overheard. So they think that both of these have really similar consequences, whether it's an insult directly to the person or just something that is commonly said, such as using gay in a negative way. And I think if you could just maybe press the arrow key again, then the rest of that content should show up. Thank you. So interestingly, Swan and colleagues validated a sexual orientation microaggression inventory just a couple of years ago in 2016, using a diverse sample of LGBTQ adolescents. And what they said was that while a wide swath of LGBTQ individuals experience acts of violence, there may also be more covert acts that occur. And they said that that might actually occur more frequently. And of course, a lot of people probably experience both. When they validated this scale, they found 3 factors that actually matched those that we discussed earlier from the Sioux literature. So microassaults, microinsults, and microinvalidations. So microassaults being societal disapproval, so that could be just general attitudes, or even events such as things we see in the news, people refusing to eat cakes or photograph a wedding, things like that. Micro insults can then be those anti-gay attitudes that are overheard. And heterosexism can be experienced in a lot of different ways. Some ways that you might experience that would be, say a lesbian couple goes to sign up their child for school and the paperwork just has a place for mother and father. That can be an example of a micro-invalidation because it's invalidating their relationship. So some people would recommend having paperwork say parent 1 and parent 2 instead of mother and father. So Balsam and colleagues also developed a scale. This one was LGBT people of color microaggression scale. They also found 3 factors, but their 3 factors were different from those mentioned before. So what they found was first LGBT racism, so racism within the LGBTQ communities. People of color heterosexism, so heterosexism within specific racial groups. And then also LGBTQ relationship racism. So this could include racism related to an interracial couple or something along those lines. And Nadal stated the following, I thought this was really powerful, that sometimes LGBT people with other marginalized identities may feel excluded, disconnected, or isolated by other LGBT people with more privileged identities. And that this can really cause even further isolation. So going back to that piece about intersectionality, those identities really cannot be separated. It does create a very different experience. So microaggressions can occur even within a community that someone identifies with based on differing identities. So I want to talk just a little bit about minority stress theory. Some of you might already be familiar with this, but to kind of put in perspective how microaggressions could be related to mental health.
So Meyer originally created the minority stress model back in 1995, and then Hendricks and Testa updated it more recently to include transgender and gender nonconforming people as well. But it provides a conceptual framework for understanding how stressors that are specifically related to that minority status are related to the increased risk for negative psychological outcomes. So it's pretty clear in the literature that there are very large mental health disparities when it comes to the LGBTQ community. So this model can help us understand why that might be. So experiences of stigma, discrimination, and marginalization can affect those negative psychological outcomes that we see. And if you move on to the next slide, I'll give a little bit more detail about that concept. So within minority stress theory, there are two different types of processes, the first one being distal and the second one being proximal. So the way that they explain this is that the distal processes are the objective events that occur, an experience of discrimination, an experience of being insulted. It could include microaggressions. These are the events that objectively occur. And that's connected to the mental health outcomes through the proximal processes. So these are the subjective perception that result from those events. What ends up happening is that people may have the following: expectations of more future external stressful events, an internalization of the prejudice or negative views. So in really taking in that shame piece, which someone had mentioned earlier in the chat box. It could potentially lead to concealment or hiding of one's identity, whether because of shame or because of just the need to feel protected. Maybe they don't feel safe to be out. And for some, it can even lead to hypervigilance, which is also a symptom of trauma-related disorders. So this is a pretty significant outcome of experiencing discrimination, marginalization, stigma, and even microaggressions. So I'll go into the case example, and again, if you could just type your responses into the chat box, I'll go ahead and read some of them out. So you are a counselor. You're working with a 16-year-old client who has been in the United States for about a year, and she relocated with her family just about a year ago from Syria to a predominantly white suburban area. She shared with you that she is attracted to women and also that she struggled to find friends since she moved to the United States. And as a counselor, you tell her that the United States is more welcoming to lesbians than other countries, and insist that if she comes out and joins some local groups that she'll definitely make some friends. So maybe, hopefully, this isn't you, but what are some of the issues that come up in this scenario? And there are a few of them. So Dale says it's problematic to tell a person that they must come out. And that's an incredibly important point, that there are a lot of reasons why people do or do not want to come out, and it's not the counselor's place to put a value judgment on that. So that's a really great point to bring up. What are some other issues that some of you see in this scenario? Right, so making a somewhat ethnocentric, maybe very ethnocentric statement that the United States is more welcoming to lesbians than other countries with no data to really back that up, just kind of making that assumption. Dustin says complete disregard for what she's going through. And Ariel says the counselor also doesn't know how the client's culture impacts the ability to come out.
Dr. Hennessy, Ray,
Yeah.
I thought this was an important response. Ray indicated when speaking of referring to Islam, for starters, might be an issue. You could be putting her life at risk by encouraging her to come out.
That could be a potential issue. I didn't see that comment, so thank you for bringing that one up.
Yes. If he didn't, I would have, because I was like, oh, yes, that's a good one.
So there could be an issue of safety. It depends. I wouldn't make that assumption about all people who follow a Muslim faith, but it could potentially be an issue regardless of faith. Safety can be a concern about coming out. Another one is just that she never identified herself as a lesbian. She simply stated that she was attracted to women. So keeping in mind that people have different ways that they might choose to be identified, and to really go with whatever the client is more comfortable with and don't put those labels on them. Any other thoughts on this before I move on to my second example?
I think Robertson, I see, has pointed out a good point, the family perspective, because would the individual have the natural supports of the family as well?
Right, and if we think about the situation where they're new to the United States, they're in a predominantly white suburban area, and she's saying that she hasn't really made any friends, her family might be her only support system. And so what they think is going to be incredibly important. Thank you. I'll go ahead and move on to the next one in the interest of time. So in this case, you are actually supervising a counseling intern, and the intern is white, 23 years old, and self-identifies as queer. So you're viewing a tape of this intern who is working with a 68-year-old African-American man. He's considering moving into a seniors community with his husband, but he's concerned about how other residents there might respond to him and his husband. The intern replies that they get it because they are also queer. After this statement, the client becomes very quiet for the remainder of their session. But when you talk to the intern about how the session went, they tell you that the client is being resistant. So A, what might have contributed to the client becoming quiet? And then B, what other concerns come up for you as a supervisor? So Dale brings up an excellent point that a 68-year-old might interpret the word queer in a very different way from someone who's 23. I see some people echoing that. The assumption that I get it, I think I saw a couple people say that as well. So definitely some issues with trying to say that they totally get the situation when obviously from the intersectional perspective, they have some very different identities and some very different positions when you look at marginalization and privilege. So the intern might identify as queer, but they're still 23 years old and white, and therefore have a very different experience. So assuming that they get it is not being very respectful to that client's situation. Dr.
Hennessy, Vienna also states the intern assumes that their definition of queer is the same as the client's identity as being married to a man. In addition, the intern does not take into account their different racial identities.
Yes, those are very good points. So this intern is not coming from an intersectional perspective. They're coming from the perspective that there is a monolithic group that is queer and that they're having the same experience despite having quite a few differences. Brittany says the young intern doesn't know the experience of being physically and medically dependent on others who may have issues. The role change and residential changes is a significant piece. There are many life changes to consider as well. And Lauren brings up a great point that the client hasn't stated how they identify. So they haven't said that they are gay. They haven't said that they are queer. So going back, as we mentioned in the last case study, to just acknowledging that people of different cultures have very different ways that they might or might not identify. And so it's important to not make those assumptions or label them. Ariel says the term resistant is also concerning, that generally means that what you are doing as a clinician is not working. So again, this intern is also really projecting onto the client that the issue must be with them. And I see a lot of great comments. I also see that we have 15 minutes, so I'll go ahead and hand it back over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hennessy. So now we're moving into the theories and interventions section with the time we have left, with considerations for questions and comments. And this is not an all-inclusive list. You know, we just have a couple of theories on here, such as multicultural counseling theories, such as intersectionality theory, relational cultural theory, and others. Society and self-sociological theory. We have narrative therapy on there. Could you go back to the theory slide, please? Okay, thank you. And solution-focused brief therapy, which may be used in situations where we're under mandates such as insurance or maybe an EAP where the sessions are limited. So really trying to get as much interventions in to help the client as possible and going from there. And so, like I said, these are just a couple of the theories that we can use with clients who may come in for any of these issues or combinations of these issues. Then for implications for counseling, going back to our first counseling class, whether it's called community counseling or introduction to counseling, and really establishing that trust and rapport. Some of the comments that were made earlier in terms of validating and recognizing that the person's experience is very real for them can definitely help to establish that rapport and trust with the clients. Developing and implementing cultural competencies for the populations that you're serving. Going back to the comment with Islam, really thinking about how a person's culture and what that means to them, their identity and how they self-identify play a role into our work with them, and tailoring our interventions to meet them where they are in a way that would be helpful rather than harmful. Similarly, recognizing cultural limitations and seeking consultation and supervision as necessary. You know, we are not going to know everything. And so sometimes it may be important to just reach out to a colleague who may have shared a similar situation with a client or have a certain expertise in an area, to just check in with them and say, hey, you know, this is what I'm dealing with in a supervision situation. Like I think back to a situation I had where I had a supervisee come out to me as transgender. And although I felt that I did the right things to help and support that person, it's not an area of expertise of mine. So I checked in with a colleague to see if what I had done were the appropriate things that they would recommend me doing. So asking questions rather than assuming anything about any client. You know, for example, what does being a Hispanic person or a person living with a disability, what does that mean to them? How do they identify and see it from their perspective? Remaining vigilant to the client's reaction to our questions. Again, paying attention to the nonverbals and maybe the comments that they may be making. And just really acknowledging the fact that we are going to make mistakes. And if we unintentionally offend a client or someone and we become aware of it, just owning that, apologizing, and trying to move on in a healthy way. Then seeking opportunities for personal growth and professional growth as well to enhance our knowledge in our toolbox, as well as seeking opportunities, which came up in some of the comments about what do we do? How do we respond when someone is doing these microaggressions or we're witnessing them from colleagues and things like that? Just really taking the time to educate, maybe inviting them to a presentation like this. And if the timing is right and the situation is appropriate, maybe pulling that person aside and saying, hey, you know, I've noticed that you've been doing this, or you've been saying, you know, just to kind of help to bring their awareness in a non-judgmental way, but still helping to increase their awareness. Engaging in client advocacy is extremely important, you know, helping our clients to become empowered to advocate for themselves in situations where they can, but in other situations where they can't, or they may not have the connections or the resources to advocate for them. And then I will turn it over to Dr. Hennessy to talk a little bit more about affirmative counseling, since that's one of her areas of expertise.
Thank you. I'll just touch on it very briefly. LGBTQ plus affirmative counseling is not necessarily always its own counseling theory, but can be incorporated regardless of your theoretical orientation. But what it does talk about is not only affirming individual identities that people have, but also understanding the social context, ridding the self of any biases or stereotypes that you might have that could be impacting your work with clients. And that piece of advocacy is also huge, especially when it comes to LGBTQ identities. A lot of advocacy has occurred, and we've seen a lot of change in the last even 20 years. And that is because of people who advocated to say LGBTQ identities are not mental illnesses, to advocate against things like conversion. So affirmative counseling is also very active and takes a big advocacy role.
All right, so this is the end of our presentation. We'll use the last few minutes that we have to address any questions or comments that anyone may have on the topic. Rachel, I saw a question for you, but it's gone. Oh, here it is. Does affirmative counseling deal directly with shame soaking?
Ray, that's a great question. So I have not seen that in the literature searches that I've done, but it's actually something I'll go ahead and look up because I'm curious now that you've raised that point. But it's not something that I've seen, and I've done pretty extensive literature searches for my dissertation, but of course I haven't seen everything. So I'll look into that. It's a really great question.
All right. Aaliyah says, how do you deal with microaggressions that show up from your clients? That's a really great question. Depending on the situation, for example, depending on the rapport that I have with that client, I've dealt with some clients that I immediately confronted it because we had that rapport and I felt like that it would be effective, while educating them on how their comment or behaviors may be hurtful to someone else without them knowing it. With others, you may have to take it a little bit more delicately and use some psychoeducation to help increase their awareness with a less non-confrontational approach. Yes, CEUs for attending the webinar tonight. Yes, you will be getting information about that later on.
And if anyone has a question they want to ask the panel directly, if you could just raise your hand, I will unmute you and allow you to ask that question.
All right, and while we wait for that, Aaron makes a very important comment here. I have had some interesting discussions with Christian therapists who seem sometimes not to understand why LGBTQIA+ folks might be wary of therapist attitudes due to religious peace. That's a really important intersection to bring up, the role of religion into a person's identity, whether they're from the LGBTQIA community. So that's a really important piece for us to educate our colleagues about how the religious aspect may cause some anxiety or some stressors for our clients that may be a member of any of those groups.
And no one's raising their hand, which is fine.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking at the question.
I was just going to add that even within your religious faith, there's so much diversity, and so definitely there are people who are very religious who don't have those same views, and so that's something to always keep in mind as well, is just trying to not make those judgments regardless of the intersection or the identity.
Yes, exactly. And also being aware of our own blind spots, especially if we're from a religious community that has some privilege, like Christianity, for example, understanding how that may cause us to have blinders, you know, that the religious aspect may create a huge barrier for the people that we work with. I'll admit that was an area of blindness for me, particularly until the Pulse shooting happened, and I was one of the counselors that responded. And it really opened my eyes to how the religious aspect created more stressors for the individuals who are already traumatized by that experience. But owning that as a blinder and then doing some research and going to trainings and stuff to increase my competency in that area was something that I did, and that we should all strive to do when we become aware of those blind spots that we all have.
Panel, James actually presented a question here. It said, I noticed that most official places to sign up ourselves calls for binary gender, but I am not binary gendered. How can we try to change this?
So again, it's going back to that advocacy piece, and thank you for raising the question. This is actually something I was just having a discussion about yesterday, related to even just signing up for ACA. It was brought to my attention that that still has only the 2 binary options. And so that's something that LGBT is working on, reaching out to ACA to find out more about not only how to change it, but also sort of what's going on within the organization, that in 2018 that would still be an issue, and just bringing it to their attention. In terms of other sort of official documents that are not related to counseling or ACA rather, this is even something you can advocate for in your own workplace as a counselor or in a university, is making sure that whether it's a write-in option or just multiple options are provided. These are things that we can all do to advocate. I hope that answers your question a little bit. If not, please write in again and let me know if there's something more I can speak to it.
And here's another question. I'm a biracial, white and Asian, but pass as white. If a client didn't realize my biracial background and was mistrustful of Asians, what would be a way to address this with the client?
This is great because I've had that type of experience. I am Black, however, I am also Hispanic. My mom's Panamanian. And so one of the things I've had when I was sitting across from another individual while working with them, they had some resistance to working with anybody of Hispanic descent. I had to remind myself that I'm a counselor and I'm working with an individual that has some clear boundaries and some biases where I actually never brought that up. There was a book by Susan Greenbaum that talks about how a lot of our identities were concealed within our racial paradigm based upon our skin color. And so she did talk about how individuals of Cuban descent, Panamanian descent, of Hispanic descent were able to get past some of those racial lines if they identified with one particular group over another. And so me putting myself back out there on Front Street, I was able just to identify with the Black African-American community rather than identifying with my mother's community of the Panamanian Hispanic side, but come into a neutral point with the individual and really address those concerns and began to work with them on a level that they began to feel comfortable with individuals of varying races.
All right, thank you, thank you. We do have one individual that wishes to ask a question, so we'll actually end tonight on this question, and then I'll ask the panel to share contact information because several individuals have inquired how to get a hold of you. So it's P. Robertson. P. Robertson, I'm going to unmute your mic so you can ask your question to the panel.
And in an administrative position for a while, and I'm going back to teaching the cross-cultural counseling course with master's level graduate students. So I'm looking for a text. And I would appreciate any suggestions that people might have. I've used Sue's text in the past, which I felt like did a really good job of covering microaggressions, but I'm looking to see what else is out there. So any suggestions would be appreciated.
I used Sue's book as well when I taught.
Panel?
No, I was just saying I used Sue's book as well when I taught that class. So I'm not sure off the top of my head of any other textbook that I would recommend.
I used Sue's book as well when I taught the multicultural class. However, during my research, I did find another book that actually provided clear and concise information. It was very good. It was by Hayes. I'm looking up the details of it right now. What I can do is I can forward that information to you in regards to the multicultural perspective that I utilized within my dissertation, and it did not come from Sue's book. It actually came from Dana Hayes' book on cultural. I'm looking up the reference directly, and I can place it inside of the chat box for you.
Dr. Hennessy?
Yeah, I was also going to add, there's a book that you could use as a supplement because it's pretty short. It's called Intersectionality in Social Work Practice, and I recommend that because there isn't one for counseling yet, but it does a good job of talking about how intersectionality can be incorporated into clinical work. So I would highly recommend that in addition to the multicultural counseling textbook that you choose, and I can share that in the text box as well.
All right, thank you, thank you, thank you. Panel, thank you very much. Before we close, I want to give you an opportunity to, one, share your contact information, because many individuals have inquired how to connect with you. So I want to give you that opportunity. And then if there's anything, any parting words you want to share with the audience before we leave tonight, please do so. And let's go ahead and start with Dr. Hennessy.
Sorry, I was looking up the reference. So I think we have a slide with our email addresses on it, don't we?
Yeah, that's right, the last slide.
But if it's too hard to get it up, it's just rachel.hennessy@okstate.edu, and I'll go ahead and just type it in here for you.
Thank you for bringing that up. And know that everyone on this particular webinar has received your notes. So you're saying that the contact information is the last slide. So I look at the last slide on your notes to get a hold of everyone. If not, you have my email. So please reach out to me, and I will share the panel's contact information with anyone.
Yeah, Dr. Hennessy and I also put our email addresses in the chat box too. But thank you all for joining us tonight, for your perspectives and insight. We really appreciate you taking your time out on a Monday evening to spend with us to learn a little bit more about this topic. And we look forward to seeing you at future events.